In early December, the United States announced that it would suspend its obligations under the INF Treaty in 60 days unless Russia returns to full compliance with the agreement. This is while Russia has repeatedly denied that it has violated the treaty. Why would the U.S. then make these allegations that Russia has denied? In this debate, we will discuss what the U.S. motives are behind this move and the dangers of the U.S. withdrawal that it would pose, which could bring these two nuclear-powered nations closer to confrontation.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has attempted to salvage the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, known as INF, days after U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to pull out of the Cold War agreement.
There are certain difficulties with this treaty. Other countries possessing short and intermediate-range missiles are not party to it. But what prevents us from starting talks under accession to the existing treaty or starting negotiating the parameters of a new treaty? Whatever the complaints about the treaty, in current conditions it plays a stabilizing role, works to support a certain level of predictability and restraint in the military sphere.
Putin said his country can easily make and deploy land-based intermediate-range missiles if the U.S. withdraws from the landmark Nuclear Arms Control Treaty. He denied his country is in violation of the INF, suggesting that the U.S. itself had breached the bilateral treaty. Earlier this month, Washington said it would withdraw from the INF within 60 days if Russia did not dismantle missiles that the U.S. claims breached the deal.
The United States and our NATO allies stand vigilant that Russia's lawless conduct will not be tolerated in the realm of arms control or anywhere else. We would welcome a Russian change of heart, a change in direction, the destruction of their program, and their follow-on continuance of the terms of the treaty. And so, over the next 60 days, they have every chance to do so.
Some analysts believe the U.S. wants to withdraw from the INF because it may be seeking to use its nuclear weapons.
What I fear is that he wants to back out of it so that the U.S. can start using intermediate-range nuclear missiles. Trump has said in the past, if we have nuclear weapons, why don't we use them? So it appears the U.S. may intend to use such weapons.
The INF Treaty was signed in December 1987 by former U.S. President Ronald Reagan and the former Soviet Union's last leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. The treaty calls for the scrapping of all ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 to 5,500 kilometers. Many fear that the ditching of the treaty could seriously undermine international weapons of mass destruction, non-proliferation regime, and spark a new arms race.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, columnist at The Hill, Brent Badowski, joins us from Washington, D.C. And we have investigative journalist Tony Gosselin, who joins us from Bristol. Gentlemen, welcome. Tony Gosselin, let me first start with you. This INF treaty required Russia and the U.S. to eliminate permanently their nuclear and conventional ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. What would the U.S. withdrawal from that then do if this is the stated goal? Wouldn't it just pretty much do away with that?
Well, look, the United States has already violated this treaty. This is one of the things that I can remember from, well, it's over 2 years ago, May 2016. De Veselu in Romania was the base where the Americans installed their Mk-41 missile defense system. They call it defense, but the Russians have pointed out that these missile batteries can also be used to launch the potentially nuclear-armed Tomahawk cruise missiles. So the US has actually broken the terms of the treaty already. They're also planning to, in just 2 years' time, to have another one of these missile batteries to violate the treaty installed in 2020 in Poland too. So actually the whole thing has really been torn up by the United States. Back in July this year, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that the Russians were violating, the Americans were violating this, and at the time what we saw was criticism not just from the Chinese. Obviously the Russians are going to criticize this, so the Chinese major superpower said, look, what do the Americans think they're doing here, in not so many words. I'm paraphrasing President Xi there, but also the Germans. Berlin spoke out saying, what are you doing? Now the reason why even the Germans are speaking out against the deployment of this missile system by the United States in Romania and Poland, is because we do not want to see Europe used as a battlefield for the United States against Russia. We know that Britain and the United States are driving much propaganda against Russia. We're seeing the demonization of Putin in the same sort of way as we saw Gaddafi demonized, Saddam Hussein demonized, President Assad demonized. And we don't want to see, and certainly the Europeans don't want to see, Europe used, and particularly Eastern Europe used, to start a war with Russia. And that's why the Germans actually took the extreme measure of speaking out against one of their NATO colleagues back earlier this year.
Well, there you go, Brent Badowski. You heard our guest there, Tony Gosselin.
Well, we obviously don't agree. Number one, I do think the Russians have been in violation of the INF agreement. I think that's true. Most Europeans agree with that. Point two, I think it would be a terrible mistake for the United States to back out of the agreement. That would be horrible, and the Europeans agree with that as well. Point three, whoever said that the United States, Trump, intends on using any nuclear weapons is an idiot. I'm not going to even discuss that any further. It's just not, as bad as Trump may be on some things, he's not going to use nuclear weapons.
But
that's
did he
just
ask
not
the question?
Something that's possible. Excuse me?
Did he ask that question once? If we have nuclear weapons, why don't we use them?
I don't care what he asked. Politicians say a lot of stuff. Trump, in particular, says a lot of stuff. I guarantee you, and I'm no supporter of President Trump on most things, there's no way, zero, that he intends to use nuclear weapons or will use nuclear weapons. Point four, what they need to do, the United States, Europe, and Russia, is to work together to make the agreement work, and even to expand the agreement and expand more arms control. Point five, Europe, the United States, and Russia cannot afford to go into a new nuclear arms race. It would be bad military policy. It would be disastrous economic policy. And I feel the same way about that as I do all these wars in the Middle East, whether it's Syria or Yemen or anywhere else. You're going to end up with a situation where everybody's going to be dead, everybody's going to be bankrupt, and everybody's going to have weapons there's no one left to use. I think it is economically insane, morally wrong, and strategically just totally without any merit. I think what we need to do is to direct everybody in all of these countries on all of these issues towards using money to make life better in the economy of all these countries. That includes everyone in the Middle East, Europe, the U.S., Russia, and China, and Korea, by the way. But we're not going to have a war. I'm not afraid of that. I am afraid that everybody goes bankrupt building all these weapons and having all these wars, and I think it would be a danger to nuclear proliferation. Whoever said that, I happen to agree with.
Okay, you talk about we. I'd like to find out from you afterwards who you mean by we. But since you are making points, this is the point that Putin has made, Tony Gosselin, in case, and I'm quoting him, the situation with which they are trying to threaten us really happens, we will have to respond accordingly. And as you understand, as we have these land-based and sea-based systems, I guess it will not be hard. Your reaction, Tony Gosselin?
Yeah, let's look at why this treaty was signed in the first place. 1987, your reporter quite rightly said at the start, between Gorbachev and Reagan, it was just before the Bush Senior era. Now, even though he was also a Republican president, Bush Senior was much more of a hawk. He was, of course, involved in the first Gulf War, getting that all started, the invasion of Kuwait and the entrapment by the US ambassador, April Glasby, of Saddam Hussein into saying that, oh, if you go into Kuwait, that'll be fine. And then, of course, as soon as Saddam Hussein actually did go into Kuwait, they jumped on him immediately. He was tricked. Saddam Hussein was tricked into thinking the Americans wouldn't mind if he went into Kuwait. And there was a very different era. What we had under Gorbachev and Reagan was something called the peace dividend. The idea was that with glasnost, with the relaxation of the authoritarianism in the Soviet Union, the whole world could start to relax. The real precedent for what's beginning to happen now was the introduction by NATO into Turkey back in 1961 and 62 of these intercontinental ballistic missile systems into Turkey. And this seems to be mirroring that, actually. And that, of course, led to the Russians putting their missiles into Cuba. And then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where people were biting their fingernails all over the world, worried that the Cold War might turn hot, in a matter of seconds. And back in those days, it's really important, I think, to remember some of the statements by the US generals who actually wanted a nuclear war. They did. And this is what worries me about the US policy, is we get one thing on the press from the public spokespeople, but what are the Pentagon saying behind the scenes? What is going on behind the scenes? Back in '62, we had General Curtis Lee May, saying, we've got the Russian bear in a trap. Maybe we should take his leg off right up to his blankety blanks. And he actually said that. And then he said, well, no, maybe, with second thoughts, maybe we should take his blankety blanks off too. This is the sort of thinking that was going on behind the scenes. We only know this now, back in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is why Reagan and Gorbachev signed that treaty. And for any nuclear-capable missile batteries to go into Romania or Poland is just asking for a rerun of that 1962 nightmare.
Do you think that, Brent Podolsky, that is the way that Pentagon officials or higher-ups in the Army are thinking when it comes to Russia and its missiles?
Well, number one, I certainly agree that General Curtis LeMay back in the 50s and 60s was a nut. That's for sure.
The film Dr. Strangelove based on him.
There's no doubt about that. Now, I have known many generals over the years, starting really in the 1970s and 80s, and I know many right now. And there's not one general I know who wants a war with anyone. And I particularly include General and Defense Secretary James Mattis, who believes that you want to deter wars, not to start wars, and that nobody can win wars once they start. I think we're in a point in the world where we have to outgrow that. And I don't know any American generals right now, and I do know a number of them, who want a war. I think they'll want to prevent war, first of all. I do think there are dangers of miscalculation. That's how most wars begin. I do think it would be important and urgent to have nuclear arms control that goes further than where we are now, to not only preserve the INF agreement, but to go further on this. I think it would be insane for both Russia and the United States and any other country at this point to go on a nuclear arms race. I also agree, by the way, and I was in the middle of that back in the 80s when I was working for Democratic leaders in Congress and working with people with Reagan who did the Reagan-Gorbachev negotiations, which were a major step forward for humanity by both countries, and there was a peace dividend, and I think we need to make that happen again in a perfect world. What negotiations are about, by definition, are countries that have differences, and we can debate the differences, talking with each other to resolve those differences in ways that are beneficial to all of those countries. But I'll clarify to be clear. No American generals want war. President Trump is not going to use nuclear weapons, whatever else anybody thinks. That's not what he wants. We do have big problems and big dangers in the world where we need more arms control and more diplomatic agreements. And I am very worried about the world economy. It's a different show on another day. And the worst thing we need in a world economy that I believe is vulnerable, and I include America, Russia, China has economic problems, Europe has economic problems, Iran and even Saudi Arabia have economic problems. We need to devote resources to having another peace dividend that helps all the people in all of those countries. The last thing we need is a nuclear arms race by anyone or nuclear proliferation from anywhere.
Well, this is what makes this interesting, Tony Gosling, regarding the decision for the U.S., which at this point is on a 60-day, I guess, ultimatum to Russia. And that is that you have Jim Mattis, you have Mike Pompeo, you have Representatives Adam Smith, Democrat, Elliot Engel, another Democrat, ranking members of the House Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committees. All of them has said that the U.S. withdrawal from this treaty is going to risk an arms race that would jeopardize the security of U.S.'s allies in Europe. And it seems like this decision was solely based on some reports, the influence that the National Security Advisor John Bolton had on the U.S. President Donald Trump. So together, they made this decision. Is that true?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, look at what John Bolton's role in the recent kidnap of the Huawei executive, Meng Wanzhou. Really a provocation. So what you've got going on here is John Bolton is running basically a private foreign policy. So most of the advisors to Trump and the committees, the Democratic end of the US government is saying, no, we don't want to provoke and make war. Actually, what John Bolton's saying is the opposite. Actually, this effectively isn't an arrest. It's a kind of kidnap. And one of the reasons that Meng Wanzhou was kidnapped, I would say, is because the Canadians and the Chinese are in the middle of doing a trade treaty, and so this spikes the guns of the Canadians. So this is a very low tactic, I think, and also, of course, it's bound to cause repercussions between China and the United States. We certainly don't need these sorts of provocations, and John Bolton seems to be doing that all on his, almost all on his own. He's got a lot of sway, obviously, personally with Trump. And it seems that maybe he's even in a stronger position than Trump is when it comes to foreign policy. But look, there is a two-faced side to US policy in many, many issues. Right, particularly to do with, we're bringing peace to Iraq in the Middle East and Libya. Look what they've done to Libya, for example, and the Brits. I'm not excusing the Brits too. I think this is part of what is actually a rather quiet policy to dominate the planet by the United States, and they use something called the unified command structure to do this. And if you go back to 2005, you'll find a fascinating report by US General Thomas Barnett called Blueprint for Action. And in that, he talks about the non-integrating gap countries, which are the ones which are not immediately aligned in military alignments with the big superpowers. And he calls for them to be destabilized right across the world. So we're talking about all small independent countries, doesn't matter how successful they are, and of course Libya was one of them, must be destabilized. And this is, I think, is actually the real US policy that's going on behind the scenes, despite what comes out in official announcements.
Well, that's interesting, and I'm sure that maybe Iran could be part of those countries. However, because we're running short of time, Brent Badowski, since our guest there talked about China in a matter of speaking, China is also a factor here, and maybe you can explain why the U.S. President Donald Trump has said that China is gaining a military advantage in Asia by deploying large numbers of these what he calls treaty non-compliant missiles. Is China part of this treaty? I mean, Trump is basically faulting China here.
Well, I think China can be faulted for some things. Well, what I had suggested and believe we should do is to stop the trade wars with Europe and the tensions with Europe and to unite the United States and Europe.
Who's going to do
to change
that?
China's
I'm sorry
policy,
to jump in. You keep saying we. We're supposed to, we should.
We is what is referring to what the United States should do. I'm referring to the United States.
Oh, I see.
And I'm referring to what the United States should do is to unite with the Europeans, not endlessly have fights with the Europeans or the Canadians or the Mexicans, but to unite them and go to China with a united front, because all of those countries have problems with what China has been doing on trade. Now, by the way, I will say, to what my colleague said a few minutes ago, I have known about and admired General and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis for many, many years. I have known about and not admired John Bolton for many, many years, and naming him was not my idea. I applauded the nomination of General Mattis to be Secretary. I did not applaud the nomination or selection, actually, of John Bolton, and I hope that President Trump ultimately is smart enough to listen to General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, and not John Bolton. My view on that has been consistent for many, many years on both men.
Okay, Tony Gosling, we have the U.S. announcement back in 2017, which was probably in the works for quite some time before they came out with an announcement, that the U.S. nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years will cost more than $1.2 trillion. And a lot of that had to do with renovation of the current nuclear system that they have in place. I'm not too sure of the details, but if the U.S. makes that type of announcement, then shouldn't Russia retaliate, or shouldn't that be a matter of concern? And doesn't that go against what they have said when it comes to INF and Russia in particular?
Well, I probably won't be the most popular person in the world for saying this, but unfortunately, nuclear weapons do need to be properly serviced and upgraded, because one of the elements involved in a nuclear weapon, the tritium, degrades, and so you have to kind of keep making sure that you're replacing or replenishing that if your nuclear weapon is actually going to work. Obviously, there's no point in having nuclear weapons if you can't use them if you need to. The problem here is that this, I would say, provocation by John Bolton and by Trump threatening to pull out of this treaty is just another thing in a whole line of provocations against Russia. We've seen, for example, the condemnation of a democratic referendum in Crimea about which country that they wanted to be aligned with. And they, as a Russian-speaking area, quite clearly wanted to be a massive, overwhelming majority of the Crimeans said we want to be with Russia. In fact, they're trying to join the Russian Federation, but they're still condemned in the Western press and by the Western military, saying, "Oh, Putin has annexed Crimea." What a load of nonsense! And then that all came from the coup in 2014, which was funded by the US State Department. A large amount of the agitation that was going on in Ukraine was funded by the US, probably the Brits too. Then we've also had the Olympics, getting rid of the Russian team from the Olympics, which is a very low move, especially since the German documentary filmmaker that condemned the Russian team said it's not just the Russians that are doing this, but they decided to pick on them anyway. Seb Coe, as the one of the main people involved in that, who is a conservative athlete on the committee. We had the Skripal PSYOP. The guy that did the Trump dossier, a guy called Christopher Steele, a private ex-MI6 guy.
Right.
So the Skripal, the Salisbury thing. We've had Syria trying to get the Russians out of their base in Tarsus. Putin is bending over backwards not to be provoked. And I think he's doing a good job in not rising to the bait, because there are many fronts on which NATO, not just the US, but NATO, is trying to provoke the Russians.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm glad we covered a lot of topics here. Thank you, columnist at The Hill, Brent Badowski, and also thank you, investigative journalist Tony Gosselin. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate from me, Kaveh Taouei. The entire team is goodbye until next week.